My name is Amanda Sinclair. I'm 49 years old, and the day my husband's children laughed at me for inheriting a worthless garage was the day I knew they had made the biggest mistake of their lives. I can still see Vanessa's face, that cruel little smile she always wore when she thought she was winning. She actually laughed. Derek stood beside her with his arms crossed, nodding like he'd just closed the deal of the century. "It's just a dusty old garage, Amanda," Derek said, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "We're being generous letting you keep it at all. Dad probably kept his lawnmower in there." Vanessa examined her perfect manicured nails. "Honestly, the demolition costs would probably exceed its value. We're doing you a favor." They wanted the beach house in Malibu. They wanted the stock portfolio. They wanted the bank accounts. And they were so desperately hungry to get their hands on what they considered the real inheritance that they couldn't wait for me to sign away my rights to everything else, including that garage. Just the second wife, Derek had reminded me that morning. Like 27 years of marriage to their father meant nothing. I signed their papers. My hand didn't even shake. What they didn't know was that Robert had trusted me with something he never shared with them, something that lived behind those peeling doors, something he'd spent decades protecting. And now it was mine, legally, completely, irrevocably mine. Vanessa even patted my shoulder on her way out. "You'll be fine, Amanda. I'm sure you can find a nice little apartment somewhere," I smiled back. I didn't say a word, because sometimes the best revenge isn't what you say, it's what you know and they don't. If you want to know what was really inside that garage and how their greed became their downfall, then subscribe and follow along. You won't believe where this story goes. The funeral was on a Tuesday. Robert had been gone for exactly 72 hours, and I hadn't slept more than a few minutes at a time. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him the way he looked that morning, kissing my forehead before heading to the garage like he did every Saturday. The way he never came back inside. Heart attack. Sudden. The doctor said he probably didn't feel any pain. That was supposed to make me feel better, but it didn't. Derek and Vanessa showed up to the funeral in matching black designer outfits that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. They hugged me at the cemetery, whispering the right words, playing the part of grieving children. But I felt how quickly they pulled away. I saw how their eyes kept darting to their phones. The first red flag should have been how fast they wanted to handle the estate. We weren't even back from the burial when Derek suggested we all sit down with Preston, their lawyer, just to get everything organized. "Amanda, so you don't have to worry about the complicated stuff during this difficult time." The complicated stuff, like I was some fragile little thing who couldn't understand paperwork. I'd been handling Robert's business accounts for 15 years. I'd been the one who organized his tax documents, who scheduled his client appointments, who kept the books for his restoration work. But sure, Derek, please protect me from the complicated stuff. We met at Preston's office the next morning. The walls were covered in expensive art, and everything smelled like leather and old money. Preston had all the documents ready, like he'd been preparing them for weeks. "Now, Amanda," he began, his voice smooth as silk, "Robert's estate is quite substantial, and we want to make sure everything is divided fairly." Fairly. That word stuck in my throat. He slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a list of assets. The beach house valued at $2.3 million, the stock portfolio, 3 bank accounts, Robert's truck, and at the very bottom, almost like an afterthought, detached garage structure and contents. "Derek and Vanessa, as Robert's biological children, have a rightful claim to the primary assets," Preston continued. "The house, the investments, the liquid assets, these represent Robert's life's work before your marriage. Like our 27 years together were just a footnote." Vanessa leaned forward, her perfectly painted lips forming a sympathetic pout. "We know this is hard, Amanda, but Dad built that beach house with our mom. It has sentimental value to us. And the investments, well, those were from his first business, the one he started when Derek and I were kids." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't a conversation. This was a script they'd rehearsed. "What we're proposing," Preston said, pulling out another document, "is that you retain the garage property. It's on a separate lot, and honestly, it would cost Derek and Vanessa more to maintain than it's worth. This way, Everyone gets something, and we avoid any lengthy legal battles that would only drain the estate. Derek nodded solemnly. We think it's the fairest solution. You get to keep something of Dad's, and we can handle the burden of the larger properties. The burden? He actually called a $2 million beach house a burden. I looked down at the papers, my vision blurring slightly. Part of me wanted to scream at them, to tell them exactly what I thought of their fair solution. But another part of me, that part that had spent 27 years watching Robert work in that garage, the part that knew what he'd whispered to me on quiet Sunday mornings, that part stayed silent. I need to think about this, I said quietly. Vanessa's smile faltered just slightly. Amanda, we really should settle this quickly. The estate taxes, the property maintenance, every day we wait costs money. I said I need to think about it. Preston cleared his throat. Of course. Take a day or two. But I should mention that if this goes to probate court, things could get very complicated for everyone involved. It was a threat wrapped in concern. Sign now, or we'll make this hell for you. I gathered the papers and stood up. My legs felt shaky, but I kept my chin up. That night, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at those documents until the words blurred together. And that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The property description for the garage was wrong. They'd listed it as single-story detached structure, but that wasn't complete. That wasn't accurate at all, and suddenly, I realized they had no idea what they were trying to take from me. The funeral was on a Tuesday. Robert had been gone for exactly 72 hours, and I hadn't slept more than a few minutes at a time. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him the way he looked that morning, kissing my forehead before heading to the garage like he did every Saturday. The way he never came back inside. Heart attack. Sudden. The doctor said he probably didn't feel any pain. That was supposed to make me feel better, but it didn't. Derek and Vanessa showed up to the funeral in matching black designer outfits that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. They hugged me at the cemetery, whispering the right words, playing the part of grieving children, but I felt how quickly they pulled away. I saw how their eyes kept darting to their phones. The first red flag should have been how fast they wanted to handle the estate. We weren't even back from the burial when Derek suggested we all sit down with Preston, their lawyer. He said it was just to get everything organized so I wouldn't have to worry about the complicated stuff during this difficult time. Like I was some fragile little thing who couldn't understand paperwork. I'd been handling Robert's business accounts for 15 years. I'd organized his tax documents, scheduled his client appointments, kept the books for his restoration work. But sure, Derek protected me from the complicated stuff. We met at Preston's office the next morning. The walls were covered in expensive art, and everything smelled like leather and old money. Preston had all the documents ready, like he'd been preparing them for weeks. He slid a folder across the desk. Inside was a list of assets. The beach house valued at $2.3 million, the stock portfolio, 3 bank accounts, Robert's truck, and at the very bottom, almost like an afterthought, detached garage structure and contents. Preston explained that Derek and Vanessa, as Robert's biological children, had a rightful claim to the primary assets. The house, the investments, the liquid assets. He said these represented Robert's life, work before our marriage. Before, like our 27 years together were just a footnote. Vanessa leaned forward with this sympathetic look on her face and told me she knew this was hard. She said Robert had built that beach house with their mom, that it had sentimental value. She claimed the investments were from his first business, the one he started when she and Derek were kids. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. This wasn't a conversation. This was a script they'd rehearsed. Preston pulled out another document and explained their proposal. I would retain the garage property. He said it was on a separate lot and would honestly cost Derek and Vanessa more to maintain than it was worth. This way, everyone gets something, and we avoid any lengthy legal battles that would only drain the estate. Derek nodded along, saying he thought it was the fairest solution. He actually said I'd get to keep something of Robert's while they handled the burden of the larger properties. The burden? He called a $2 million beach house a burden. I looked down at the papers, my vision blurring slightly. Part of me wanted to scream at them, But another part, the part that had spent 27 years watching Robert work in that garage. The part that knew what he'd whispered to me on quiet Sunday mornings, that part stayed silent. I told them I needed to think about it. Vanessa's smile faltered. She insisted we should settle this quickly. Something about estate taxes and property maintenance. She said every day we wait it costs money. I repeated that I needed time. Preston cleared his throat and mentioned that if this went to probate court, things could get very complicated for everyone involved. It was a threat wrapped in concern. Sign now, or we'll make this hell for you. I gathered the papers and stood up. My legs felt shaky, but I kept my chin up as I walked out of that office. That night, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at those documents until the words blurred together. I went through every page, every clause, every property description, and that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The property description for the garage was wrong. They'd listed it as a single-story detached structure with approximate square footage of 600 feet. 600 square feet. But that wasn't complete. That wasn't accurate at all. And suddenly, I realized they had absolutely no idea what they were trying to take from me. More importantly, they had no idea what they were about to hand me on a silver platter. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I kept thinking about that property description, single-story detached structure, 600 square feet. The words played over and over in my mind like a broken record. They had no idea. Preston had no idea. Derek and Vanessa, in all their arrogance and greed, had absolutely no clue what they were signing away. At 3 a.m, I finally gave up on sleep and walked outside. The air was cold and damp, and my bare feet left prints in the dew-covered grass as I made my way to the garage. I hadn't been inside since Robert died. I couldn't bring myself to face it, to see his workspace without a minute, to smell the motor oil and old leather without hearing his voice. But now I needed to see it with new eyes. Legal eyes. The door creaked when I pushed it open, and the motion sensor lights flickered on one by one. There it was, the 1957 Chevrolet Bel Air, covered in its protective tarp, sitting exactly where Robert had left it. His tools hung neatly on the pegboard wall. His coffee mug still sat on the workbench, a ring of dried coffee at the bottom. My chest tightened, but I forced myself to keep moving. I walked to the Bel Air and ran my hand along its covered hood. Robert had been so particular about this car, more protective of it than any of the others he'd worked on over the years. At first, I thought it was just because it had been his father's car, the one he'd learned to drive in. But then, about 15 years ago, he'd shown me the truth. I pulled back the tarp and knelt beside the driver's side door. My fingers found the small release mechanism hidden beneath the door sleeve. Never notice it unless you knew exactly where to look. I pressed it, and I heard the familiar click. The floor panel beside the car shifted. I lifted it away, revealing the wooden stairs that descended into darkness. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I fumbled for my phone and turned on the flashlight, then carefully made my way down. The underground room was exactly as Robert had left it. Climate-controlled, perfectly lit once I found the switch. And there they were, 12 cars, each one more beautiful than the last, arranged in 2 perfect rows like sleeping giants. The Ferrari, the Shelby Cobra, the Mercedes-Benz Goldwing, the Jaguar E-Type, cars that Robert had spent 3 decades finding, buying, and meticulously restoring. Cars that he'd told me were his insurance policy, his legacy, his way of making sure I'd be taken care of if anything ever happened to him. I'd watched him work on every single one. I'd handed him tools, brought him coffee, listened to him explain the history of each vehicle like they were old friends. And 5 years ago, when his doctor had warned him about his heart, Robert had done something that his children would never have expected. He'd transferred every single title into my name. I walked along the rows, running my fingers over polished chrome and restored leather. I knew the value of these cars. Robert had kept meticulous records in a fireproof safe mounted to the wall. I pulled out the binder now and flipped through the pages. Purchase prices, restoration costs, current market values, insurance appraisals. My hands started shaking when I saw the total at the back of the binder. Robert had updated it just 2 months before he died. But that wasn't even the worst part. Tucked into the back pocket of the binder, I found something else, a folder marked for Amanda, if needed. Inside were printed emails between Derek and a real estate developer, dated from 6 months ago. They were discussing the property, talking about lot values and development potential. Derek had written that once his father was gone, they'd have to deal with the second wife situation, but that it shouldn't be too complicated. The second wife situation. Me. I was a situation to be dealt with. Another email, this one from Vanessa to Preston, asked about the legal grounds for contesting a will if someone could be proven mentally incapable. She'd written that their father had been acting strangely, making poor financial decisions, and maybe showing signs of dementia. Robert had been sharp as a tack until the day he died, but that didn't matter to them. I sat down on the concrete floor, surrounded by millions of dollars in classic cars, holding proof that my stepchildren had been planning to destroy me long before Robert's heart gave out. And that's when something inside me shifted. The grief was still there, it would always be there, but it was joined by something else now, something harder, something that tasted like steel. They wanted to take everything from me. They'd already decided I was worthless, disposable, an obstacle standing between them and their inheritance. Well, they were about to learn that this second wife wasn't going anywhere. I signed their papers 3 days later. I sat in Preston's office with Derek and Vanessa flanking me like vultures, and I signed every single document they put in front of me. My signature was steady. My face was calm. I even managed a small, resigned smile when Vanessa squeezed my hand and told me I was doing the right thing. Inside, my heart was racing. But they couldn't see that. The agreement was simple. They would take the beach house, the stock portfolio, the bank accounts, and Robert's truck. I would keep the garage property and whatever was inside it. Preston made a big show of explaining that I was also waiving any future claims to the estate, that this was a final and binding settlement. I nodded along like I understood maybe half of what he was saying. Derek relaxed visibly once the papers were signed. He actually loosened his tie and leaned back in his chair like a man who just won a difficult negotiation. Vanessa pulled out her phone and immediately started texting someone, probably her husband, telling him the good news. Preston gathered the documents and assured me I'd receive copies within the week. He said something about how clean settlements like this were better for everyone, how he'd avoided months of costly legal battles. I thanked him for his time and stood to leave. That's when Vanessa made her mistake. She walked me out to the parking lot, linking her arm through mine like we were old friends. She told me she was glad we could handle this like adults, that she knew Robert would have wanted his family to stay together. Then she mentioned that she and Derek were planning to list the beach house immediately. Apparently, there was already a buyer interested, someone who'd offered above asking price. I asked her when they were planning to close the sale. She said probably within 6 weeks, at most. Then she laughed and said something about how she couldn't wait to finally take that trip to Europe she'd been planning. Derek was apparently buying a new Porsche, with money from selling Robert's house, the house he'd built with his own hands, board by board. But I just smiled and told her that sounded wonderful. Then she said something that made my blood stop cold. She mentioned that Preston had been brilliant about the whole thing, that he'd advised them weeks ago about how to structure the settlement to minimize any complications. She said he'd told them the key was making me feel like I was getting something valuable, even if it was essentially worthless. Weeks ago, they'd been planning this with Preston for weeks, probably since the moment Robert's doctor had mentioned his heart condition last year. Vanessa kept talking, completely oblivious to the fact that she'd just confirmed everything I'd suspected. She told me Derek had wanted to contest the will entirely, to argue that Robert hadn't been in his right mind when he'd made certain financial decisions in recent years. But Preston had convinced them this approach was cleaner, faster, and less likely to attract unwanted attention. I asked what she meant by unwanted attention. She waved her hand dismissively and said something about how estates always attracted people looking for a piece of the pie. And the last thing they needed was some investigation into Robert's business dealings or asset transfers. Better to just divide things quickly and quietly. Asset transfers. She had no idea how right she was. We reached my car, and Vanessa hugged me goodbye. She told me to take care of myself, that if I needed anything at all, I shouldn't hesitate to call. Then she slipped back into her Mercedes and drove away, probably already mentally redecorating the beach house for the new buyers. I sat in my car for a long time after she left, my hands gripping the steering wheel. They'd been planning this for months. They'd manipulated the settlement to make sure I got nothing of real value, or so they thought. They'd even discussed contesting Robert's mental state, prepared to drag his memory through the mud just to squeeze out a bigger inheritance. But in their greed and their arrogance, they'd made one critical error. Vanessa had just told me they were terrified of anyone looking too closely at Robert's recent asset transfers, which meant they had no idea those transfers had already happened. And they definitely didn't know who the assets had been transferred to. I started my car and drove home to my worthless garage, a plan already forming in my mind. The next morning, I did something I'd been avoiding since Robert died. I went through his personal files, not the business records or the car documentation, but his private papers, the things he kept in the locked drawer of his desk in our bedroom. I'd always known the combination. Robert had never hidden anything from me. But going through someone's private thoughts after they're gone feels like a violation, even when they're your husband of 27 years. Inside the drawer, I found 3 leather journals, stacked neatly on top of each other. Robert had always been a writer, jotting down thoughts and memories in his careful, precise handwriting. I'd seen him writing in these journals countless times, usually late at night when he couldn't sleep. I opened the most recent one first. The entries from the last year made my stomach turn. Robert had documented everything, every conversation with Derek and Vanessa, every request for money, every thinly veiled threat. He'd written about how Derek had asked him for $200,000 to invest in some business opportunity, and when Robert had refused, Derek had stopped calling for 3 months. He'd documented Vanessa's complaints about the will, how she'd told him it wasn't fair that he'd left everything equally between her, Derek, and me. She'd argued that I'd only been in his life for 27 years, while she and Derek had been his children for their entire lives, as if love and family could be measured in years like some kind of investment return. But the entry that broke my heart was dated almost exactly 1 year ago. Robert had written about a conversation he'd overheard at Derek's house during a family dinner. He'd gone upstairs to use the bathroom and heard Derek and Vanessa talking in the study. They were discussing his health, his age, and what they called the timeline. Robert wrote that he'd stood outside that door, listening to his own children calculate how much longer he had to live. Derek had said the heart condition was actually good. News it meant things would move faster than they'd expected. Vanessa had worried about the garage and all the time Robert spent there. She'd said she didn't understand why he was wasting money on old cars when he could be enjoying his retirement, traveling, spending time with them. Derek had laughed and told her not to worry about the garage. He'd said whatever junk their father was hoarding in there, they'd just have it hauled away once he was gone. Then they could sell the land apparently. It was worth more empty than with that old building on it. Robert had written that he'd stood there for almost 10 minutes, listening to his children plan his estate like he was already dead. Then he'd walk back downstairs, finish dinner, and kiss them both goodbye like nothing had happened. That was the night he'd started transferring the car titles into my name. I flipped through more entries, each one more painful than the last. Robert documented how Derek had tried to get him to sign a new will, bringing Preston to a family lunch without warning. How Vanessa had suggested he get tested for dementia after he'd forgotten her birthday. 1 year the first time he'd ever forgotten, and only because he'd been in the hospital with chest pains. He wrote about how they'd never asked about his health except in the context of whether he was keeping up with his medications or taking care of himself. Never out of love. Always with this underlying current of concern about protecting their inheritance. But the entry that changed everything was dated 6 months before Robert died. He'd discovered something that made him realize just how deep their betrayal went. Derek had taken out a loan using the beach house as collateral, a house he didn't even own yet, by forging Robert's signature on financial documents. Robert had found out by accident when the bank called about a missed payment. Derek had borrowed $300,000, claiming it was for home renovations on Robert's behalf. The bank had assumed Robert knew about it because the documentation seemed legitimate. Robert had confronted Derek, who'd cried and apologized and promised to fix everything. He'd said he was in trouble, that he owed people money, that he'd made some bad investments and was desperate. He'd begged Robert not to report it, promising he'd pay back every penny as soon as the family business deal went through. There was no family business deal. There never had been. Robert had written that he'd agreed not to press charges on one condition: Derek had to sign a document admitting to the fraud, notarized and dated, which Robert would keep in case Derek ever tried something like this again. Derek had signed it, probably thinking it was a small price to pay to avoid prison. I searched through the drawer frantically, my hands shaking, and there it was, a sealed envelope marked insurance in Robert's handwriting. Inside was Derek's signed confession, the forged bank documents, and a notarized statement from Robert documenting the entire incident. My husband had known, he'd known exactly who his children were, what they were capable of, and what they'd do the moment he was gone. And he'd spent his last months building a fortress of protection around me, brick by brick, document by document. I sat on the floor of our bedroom, surrounded by evidence of betrayal, and finally understood. This wasn't about inheritance or money or property. This was about Robert choosing me over them, and them never being able to forgive either of us for it. They didn't just want his money. They wanted to erase me, to rewrite history so that their father's love for me didn't matter, didn't count, didn't exist. Well, I had news for them. I existed. I mattered, and I was holding enough evidence to destroy them both. I knew I couldn't do this alone. The evidence I had was damning Robert's journals, Derek's signed confession about the loan fraud, the emails about contesting the will. But evidence means nothing if you don't know how to use it properly. I needed someone who understood the law, someone who could help me navigate what was about to become a very complicated situation. And I needed someone Derek and Vanessa would never see coming. I found her name in Robert's old business contacts, Sandra Mitchell, an attorney who'd helped Robert with some contract disputes about 5 years ago. I remembered meeting her once at a dinner party. She'd been sharp, direct, and had made Derek visibly uncomfortable when she'd asked him pointed questions about his business ventures. I called her office that Monday morning. Her assistant tried to schedule me for 3 weeks out, but I told her it was urgent, that it involved estate fraud and time-sensitive matters. 20 minutes later, Sandra herself called me back. We met at a small coffee shop in Santa Monica, far from anywhere Derek or Vanessa might accidentally see us. Sandra was exactly as I remembered, mid-50s, silver hair cut short, eyes that didn't miss anything. She ordered black coffee and got straight to business. I laid everything out for her. The rushed estate settlement, the property description errors, the underground garage and its contents, Robert's journals documenting Derek and Vanessa's plans, the loan fraud confession, the emails about contesting his mental state. I watched her face carefully as I talked, trying to gauge whether she thought I had a case or if I was wasting both of our time. She didn't interrupt once. She just took notes in quick, efficient shorthand, occasionally asking me to clarify a date or a detail. When I finished, she sat back and studied me for a long moment. Then she told me I didn't just have a case, I had a nuclear weapon. Sandra explained that the settlement I'd signed was legally binding, which was good news for me. Derek and Vanessa had specifically waived all claims to the garage property and its contents in writing. They couldn't come back later and argue they didn't know what was there, because they'd signed documents stating they were relinquishing any claims regardless of the content's value. But that wasn't the best part. She told me that Derek's loan fraud was a felony. The statute of limitations hadn't expired, and I was now in possession of a signed confession. If Derek had used any of that money, which he almost certainly had done then, participated in dividing Robert's estate without disclosing this debt, he'd potentially committed additional fraud. The emails about contesting Robert's mental state, combined with the journals showing Robert was completely lucid and documenting their manipulation, could potentially expose them to civil liability for elder abuse and emotional distress, even posthumously. Sandra leaned forward and asked me what I wanted. Revenge? Justice? Just to protect myself and what Robert had left me. I thought about that question for a long time. I told her I wanted them to understand that I wasn't disposable, that Robert's love for me wasn't something they could just erase with paperwork and lies, that every cruel word, every dismissive gesture, every time they'd treated me like I was nothing, I wanted them to feel the weight of all of it at once. She nodded slowly and told me she could work with that. Over the next hour, we mapped out a strategy. Sandra explained that the smartest move was to let Derek and Vanessa proceed with their plans, let them sell the beach house, spend the money, get comfortable in their victory. Meanwhile, we'd document everything, prepare our case, and wait for the perfect moment. She told me the key was patience. If we moved too fast, they might be able to recover, to regroup, and mount a defense. But if we waited until they'd overextended themselves, until they'd spent money they thought was safely theirs, until they'd made promises to other people based on their new wealth, that's when we'd strike. Sandra asked if I was prepared for how ugly this might get. She told me that Derek and Vanessa would fight back, that they'd say terrible things about me, that they might even try to destroy my reputation to protect themselves. I thought about Robert standing outside that study, listening to his children calculate his death. I thought about the word situation in Vanessa's email. I thought about Derek calling the garage worthless while planning to demolish it for land value. I told Sandra I was ready. She smiled a cold, calculating smile that made me understand why Derek had been uncomfortable around her and told me she'd start preparing the documentation. She said to call her immediately if Derek or Vanessa contacted me about anything and to keep playing the role of the grieving, compliant widow. I could do that. I'd been underestimated my entire life. One more performance wouldn't kill me. We shook hands in the parking lot, and as I watched Sandra drive away, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. 6 weeks passed, and I played my part perfectly. I returned Derek's occasional phone calls with a subdued voice, updating him on how I was coping, thanking him for checking in on me. I sent Vanessa a sympathy card when her cat died, complete with a handwritten note about how I understood loss. I even accepted that invitation to a family dinner at Derek's house, where I sat quietly and nodded along as they discussed their plans for the future. The beach house had sold $3.1 million, $50,000 over asking price. I watched Vanessa's face light up when she told me about it over dessert. She said the buyers were some tech couple from San Francisco who loved the original architecture and wanted to preserve Robert's craftsmanship. At least that part made my heart hurt a little less, knowing Robert's work would be respected. Derek mentioned he'd paid off some debts and was looking at investment properties. Vanessa had already booked her Europe trip 3 weeks in Italy, staying at 5-star hotels. She showed me pictures on her phone of the villa she'd rented in Tuscany. I smiled and told her it looked beautiful, but Sandra and I had been busy too. She'd spent those 6 weeks building an airtight case, documenting every transaction, every timeline, every communication. She'd hired a forensic accountant who'd traced Derek's loan fraud money and discovered he'd used it to pay off gambling debts, something he'd never disclosed to Robert or the estate. She'd obtained official appraisals for every single car in the underground garage, complete with authentication certificates and market valuations. And she'd found something else, something I hadn't even known to look for. Preston, Derek, and Vanessa's lawyer had a professional relationship with Derek that went beyond just legal counsel. They'd been business partners in a failed real estate venture 4 years ago. Preston had a financial incentive to help Derek maximize his inheritance. They'd apparently agreed to split the profits from flipping the beach house property. That was an ethical violation. A big one. Sandra told me it was time. The moment we'd been waiting for had finally arrived. Derek and Vanessa had spent the money. They'd made commitments based on their newfound wealth. They'd gotten comfortable, complacent, and most importantly, they'd stopped thinking about me entirely. I was just the second wife who'd faded quietly into the background, exactly as they'd planned. The trigger for our counterattack came from an unexpected source. She called me on a Thursday afternoon, her voice tight with barely contained excitement. She told me she and Derek had been talking, and they wanted to help me out. They knew I was struggling financially, been very careful to mention money troubles during our recent conversations, and they had a generous offer. They wanted to buy the garage property from me. Vanessa explained that they felt bad about how the estate had been divided, that they realized the garage wasn't actually worth much, and they didn't want me struggling to maintain a property that was just a financial burden. They were willing to offer me $50,000 for the land and the structure, which she said was actually more than market value considering how much work it would need. $50,000 for a property containing 12 classic cars worth over $14 million. She told me to think about it, but not for too long. They had a developer interested in the lot who needed an answer within 2 weeks. I told her I'd consider it and thanked her for thinking of me. The moment I hung up, I called Sandra. She laughed, actually laughed, and told me this was even better than we'd hoped. They weren't just being greedy anymore. They were actively trying to defraud me, and now we had the phone call recorded on my cell phone as evidence. Virginia's a one-party consent thought I could legally record any conversation I was part of. Sandra asked if I was ready to move forward. Once we started this, there was no going back. Derek and Vanessa would know I'd been planning this, that I'd been playing them the entire time. I thought about Robert's journals, about him standing outside that door, listening to his children plan his death, about the Wardgy situation, about Vanessa's offer $50,000 for $14 million, delivered with fake concern and sisterly love. I told Sandra I was ready. She said she'd file the paperwork first thing Monday morning. We'd start with a formal legal challenge to the estate settlement based on fraud and misrepresentation. Backed by Derek's loan confession and Preston's conflict of interest, we'd file for a full accounting of all estate assets and transactions. And then, once we had their attention, we'd invite them to a meeting where they'd finally learn what was really inside that worthless garage. Sandra told me to expect a call from Derek within 48 hours of the filing. She said he'd be angry, confused, probably threatening. She told me not to engage, not to explain, just to refer him to her office. That weekend, I went down to the underground garage one last time before everything changed. I walked among those beautiful cars, running my hands over their restored surfaces, remembering Robert's voice as he'd explain the history of each one. He'd known this day would come. He'd prepared for it, protected me, given me everything I needed to fight back. I just hoped he'd be proud of what I was about to do. Monday morning arrived with clear skies and a cold wind. Somewhere across town, Sandra was filing our lawsuit. Derek and Vanessa were probably having breakfast, planning their day, completely unaware that their entire world was about to collapse. I made myself coffee and waited for my phone to ring. It didn't take long. Derek called at 9:47 in the morning, exactly 90 minutes after Sandra filed the lawsuit. I let it ring 4 times before answering. My hand was steady, but my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He demanded to know what the hell I thought I was doing, told me I'd signed a legal settlement, threatened to countersue me for harassment and legal fees. His voice was shaking with rage. That carefully controlled facade he usually wore completely shattered. I waited until he ran out of breath, then calmly told him to contact my attorney, Sandra Mitchell, for any further communication. I gave him her number and hung up before he could respond. Vanessa called 6 minutes later. She tried a different approach, hurt, confused, betrayed. She told me she couldn't believe I was doing this, that they'd tried to help me, that she'd considered me family. She actually started crying, asking what Robert would think if he could see me tearing the family apart like this. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. I gave her Sandra's number too and ended the call. The meeting was scheduled for Friday afternoon at Sandra's office. Derek, Vanessa, and Preston would be there, along with Sandra, myself, and the forensic accountant Sandra had hired. Sandra had made it clear this wasn't a negotiation, it was an informational session where we'd be presenting evidence and discussing next steps. Preston had tried to get the meeting canceled, claiming it was irregular and unnecessary. Sandra had responded by CCing the California State Bar on her next email, casually mentioning Preston's undisclosed business relationship with Derek and asking if he felt that represented a conflict of interest in his handling of Robert's estate. The meeting stayed on the calendar. Those 5 days were the longest of my life. I barely slept. I kept rehearsing what I'd say, how I'd present everything, imagining their faces when they finally understood. Part of me was terrified I'd made a mistake, that somehow they'd find a loophole, that the cars wouldn't be enough, that I'd end up with nothing after all. But Sandra's confidence never wavered. She told me we had them cornered, that every move they'd made had only strengthened our case. Friday arrived cold and gray, with rain threatening. I dressed carefully, nothing too formal, nothing that screamed victory, just a simple black dress and Robert's watch, the one I'd given him on our 20th anniversary. Sandra's conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Los Angeles. Derek and Vanessa were already seated when I arrived, Preston between them like a shield. Derek's jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle twitching. Vanessa wouldn't look at me. Sandra started by laying out the timeline, the rushed estate settlement, the property descriptions, the signatures on documents, waiving all claims to the garage and its contents. She presented it all methodically, without emotion, like a prosecutor building a case. Then she moved to the fraud evidence. Derek's face went white when she slid the loan confession across the table, his own signature. Notarized, admitting to forging Robert's name on bank documents, she explained that this constituted felony fraud, that the statute of limitations was still active, and that Derek's failure to disclose this debt during estate proceedings potentially constituted additional fraud. Preston tried to interrupt, but Sandra cut him off smoothly and moved to his conflict of interest. She had documentation of his business partnership with Derek, emails discussing their plan to flip the beach house, even text messages about splitting the profits. She explained that representing Derek and Vanessa while having undisclosed financial interests in the outcome was a serious ethical violation. Preston's face had gone from confident to pale to slightly green. But Sandra wasn't done. She presented the emails Vanessa and Derek had sent discussing ways to contest Robert's will by claiming mental incapacity. Then she presented Robert's journals page after page of clear, coherent, devastating documentation of their manipulation and betrayal. The forensic accountant explained how Derek had used the fraudulent loan money to pay gambling debts, never intending to repay it. Finally, Sandra slid one more document across the table. They recorded transcript of Vanessa's phone call offering me $50,000 for the garage property. The room was completely silent. Derek found his voice first. He said we still hadn't explained what this was about, that they'd given me the garage property fair and square, that I was just bitter and trying to cause trouble. He demanded to know what we actually wanted. Sandra looked at me and nodded. This was my moment. I stood up and walked to the front of the room where Sandra had set up a projector. My hands were shaking slightly as I pulled up the first image of photograph of the underground garage, taken just last week. 12 pristine classic cars arranged in perfect rows, each one gleaming under the climate-controlled lighting. I watched Derek's face as recognition slowly dawned, watched Vanessa's mouth fall open, watched Preston close his eyes like he was in physical pain. I clicked through the images one by one. The Ferrari 250 GT, the Shelby Cobra 427, the Mercedes-Benz Trizentis SL. Each photograph included the authentication certificates, the restoration documentation, and the current market appraisal. I told them about the titles, all transferred into my name over 5 years ago. I explained that Robert had spent 30 years building this collection, protecting it, preparing for exactly this moment. I showed them the property deed, which clearly included all structures and substructures on the lot, including the underground garage they'd never known existed. The total value flashed on the screen, $14.3 million. Vanessa made a sound like she'd been punched. Derek just stared at the screen, his face completely bloodless. I told them about the legal settlement they'd pushed through so quickly, how they'd specifically waived all claims to the garage property and its contents, how they'd been so eager to take what they thought was valuable that they'd signed away what was actually priceless. Then I told them about Robert's final year, about how he'd discovered Derek's fraud, about how he'd overheard them planning his estate like he was already dead, about every documented instance of their manipulation and cruelty. I told them that Robert had built them each a car with his own hands, a 1969 Mustang for Derek and a 1967 Thunderbird for Vanessa that he'd planned to give them before he died. But after everything he'd documented in those journals, he'd made a different choice. Those cars were in the underground garage too. They'd been part of the worthless property Derek and Vanessa had so eagerly signed away. The silence in that room was deafening. Sandra concluded by presenting our terms. We wouldn't pursue criminal charges for the loan fraud if Derek agreed to certain conditions. We wouldn't report Preston's ethical violations if he cooperated fully. And we wouldn't seek damages for emotional distress or elder abuses, long as Derek and Vanessa never contacted me again and agreed to a permanent, legally binding separation of our family ties. The beach house sale would stand. The money they'd already spent was theirs to keep, but they would never get another penny from Robert's legacy, and they would never again pretend to be victims of an unfair estate division. Derek finally spoke, his voice hollow, He asked if this had all been a setup, if I'd been planning this from the beginning. I looked him in the eye and told him the truth. Robert had been planning this from the beginning. I'd just been honoring his wishes. We left them sitting in that conference room, staring at photographs of $14 million they'd laughed at and thrown away. The rain had started by the time I reached the parking lot. I stood there for a moment, letting it wash over my face, feeling lighter than I had in months. It was over. Finally, it was over. 3 months have passed since that meeting in Sandra's office, and I'm sitting in the kitchen of the beach house, my beach house, now watching the sun rise over the Pacific Ocean. The legal battle ended more quietly than I expected. Derek and Vanessa signed Sandra's agreement within a week. Preston settled with the state bar, accepting a formal reprimand and agreeing to make restitution for his ethical violations. Derek paid back the fraudulent loan using money from the beach house sale, though it meant sacrificing most of what he'd planned to invest. Vanessa's trip to Italy was canceled. Derek never bought that Porsche. I didn't keep all the cars. That was never the point. I sold 8 of them through a private auction house that specialized in classic vehicles. The process took 2 months, and every single car went to collectors who understood their value, who would care for them the way Robert had. The Ferrari went to a museum in Arizona where it would be displayed alongside other automotive masterpieces. The Shelby Cobra went to a collector in Texas who'd been searching for that exact model for 15 years. The sales generated just over $11 million after fees and taxes. I kept 4 cars. The 1957 Bel Air that had hidden the secret for so long, the 1969 Mustang that Robert had built for Derek, the 1967 Thunderbird he'd built for Vanessa, and a 1963 Corvette Stingray that had been Robert's personal favorite, the first car he'd ever restored. The Mustang and Thunderbird sit in the underground garage, perfect and untouched. I couldn't bring myself to sell them, even after everything. They represent something I'm not sure what yet. Maybe forgiveness eventually. Maybe just a reminder of what could have been if Robert's children had chosen love over greed. The beach house situation resolved itself in an unexpected way when I filed to contest the sale, citing the fraudulent circumstances under which the estate had been settled. Derek and Vanessa's portion of the proceeds was frozen during the investigation. By the time everything was resolved, they owed significant legal fees and had already spent money they couldn't recover. They agreed to sell me their shares of the property for what they'd actually netted, after Robert's debts and estate taxes, about $400,000 each. Less than a third of what the house was worth, but more than they deserved. I paid them, and I've never heard from either of them again. The house feels different now that it's truly mine. I've been slowly redecorating, replacing their mother's choices with things that feel like Robert and me. I kept his workshop tools, his favorite chair, the photographs of us scattered throughout the rooms, but I also added new things, paintings I'd always loved, furniture that felt like home, a garden that I'm building from scratch. I started the foundation last month. The Robert Sinclair Automotive Restoration Foundation provides scholarships and apprenticeships for young people interested in learning the craft Robert loved so much. We partner with technical schools and community colleges, offering grants for tools and training, connecting students with master craftsmen who can teach them skills that are slowly disappearing. The foundation is funded by the car sales, and it will run for decades. Robert's legacy isn't just preserving, it's growing, touching lives he never met, teaching skills to people who will pass them down to others. That feels right. That feels like something Robert would have wanted. I think about him every day. The grief hasn't disappeared. I don't think it ever will, but it's changed shape. It's softer now, mixed with gratitude and pride and a fierce protective love for everything he built and everything he gave me. Sometimes I go down to the underground garage and just sit with the cars. I'll run my hand over the Bel Air's hood and remember Robert explaining how his father taught him to drive in this exact car. I'll sit in the Corvette and smell the leather and motor oil and feel close to him in a way that makes the loneliness bearable. The biggest surprise came 2 weeks ago. I received a actual handwritten letter from Derek's daughter, Emily. She's 17, and she wrote to tell me she'd always loved her grandfather, that she'd heard what happened with the estate, and that she was sorry for how her father had treated me. She asked if she could visit sometime. If I'd be willing to tell her stories about Robert and maybe show her the cars he'd restored. She said she was thinking about studying mechanical engineering and she wanted to understand the work her grandfather had loved. I wrote back immediately and invited her for lunch next weekend. Maybe that's the real twist in all of this. The final revelation isn't about money or revenge or justice. It's about discovering that family isn't always who you're born to. Sometimes it's who chooses you, who values you, who sees you for who you really are. Derek and Vanessa spent their entire lives as Robert's children, but they never really knew him. They never understood what mattered to him, what brought him joy, what he was building in that garage behind the house. They looked at him and saw money, inheritance, assets to be divided. I looked at him and saw a man who could spend 14 hours restoring a carburetor and explain every step with the patience of a teacher, who brought me coffee in the morning and kissed my forehead like it was a sacred ritual, who built beauty with his hands and protected me with his planning and loved me enough to make sure I'd be safe even after he was gone. They called me the second wife. Like I was somehow less than. Like the 27 years I spent loving their father didn't count as much as their biological connection to him. But sitting here, in this house, watching the sunrise over water that Robert and I watched together hundreds of times, I understand something they never will. I wasn't the second wife. I was the right wife. The one Robert chose every single day. The one he trusted with his secrets, in his legacy, and his final act of protection. And that worthless garage they laughed at. It wasn't just a building full of valuable cars, it was Robert's way of telling me, even after death, that he'd always known exactly who his children were. And he'd chosen me anyway. I've learned something through all of this. Real value is never about what something looks like on the surface. It's not about property deeds or bank accounts or who has the biggest inheritance. It's about what you build with your hands and your heart. It's about the legacy you leave in people's memories, in skills passed down, in love that survives even grief. Derek and Vanessa got their beach house money. They got to feel like winners for a few brief weeks. But they lost something they'll never get back. They lost their father's respect, his trust, and any chance of understanding who he really was. I lost you, Robert, and that pain will never completely heal. But I gained everything else. His legacy, his protection, his final gift of empowerment. And most importantly, I gained the certainty that I was loved truly, deeply, unconditionally loved by a man who saw my value when his own children tried to make me invisible. So if you're out there dealing with people who underestimate you, who treat you like you don't matter, who assume they're smarter than you, remember this story. Remember that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stay quiet. Watch carefully and wait for the moment when their own arrogance becomes their downfall. And remember that the people who truly love you will always find a way to protect you, even from beyond the grave. Before I go, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I love knowing this story is reaching people all over the world, and your support means everything to me. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel. There are more stories to tell, more lessons learned the hard way, more proof that underestimating people is always a mistake. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being here with me through every twist, every revelation, every moment of justice finally served. Robert would have liked knowing his story mattered to people, that it helped someone, somewhere, understand their own worth. And I like knowing that too.